Italy, Luxembourg, Slovakia, Spain, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, in February, this Council marked 3 years since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war that has brought immense suffering and instability to the region and beyond. On that occasion, this Council and the General Assembly adopted resolutions calling for its swift end and for a lasting peace. Since then, we have seen intense diplomatic engagement, but we have also seen an intensification of the fighting across Ukraine and at times into the Russian Federation. Ukrainian civilians continue to endure relentless bombardment in their homes, schools, hospitals and shelters. Critical civilian infrastructure is being destroyed with alarming regularity, and the number of Russian missiles and drones striking Ukrainian cities and towns has reached record levels. As a result, the past months have seen some of the highest numbers of civilian casualties since the war began. Overall, more than 14,000 civilians, including hundreds of children, have been killed in Ukraine. Over 36,000 civilians have been injured, and these are just the verified numbers. Civilians inside the Russian Federation are also increasingly being affected. Let me be clear. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. They must stop now. In Ukraine, access to water, electricity, healthcare and education has been severely disrupted. Massive strikes on energy infrastructure threaten to plunge millions into darkness and cold as they face a forced winter at war. The threat to nuclear sites remains deeply concerning, particularly at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. All parties must uphold their responsibilities under international law to protect their safety and security. The United Nations remains fully mobilized to continue our life-saving aid to all those in need. I call on donors to scale up their contributions to the humanitarian response plan for those affected by the war inside Ukraine and across the region. And I urge all parties to ensure safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to reach the most vulnerable wherever they are. Mr. President, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, the latest incidents impacting neighbouring countries remind us of the real risk of further expansion of the conflict and the continuing threat it poses to European security. 3.5 years into this war, our position remains clear, principled and consistent: to respect and protect civilians, to mitigate the regional and global impact of the conflict, and to uphold the UN Charter. Recent high-level diplomatic efforts deserve recognition. I commend the dedication and political will demonstrated by the United States and others seeking to enable diplomatic solutions. I also welcome the direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Istanbul, which have led to the return of hundreds of prisoners of war. They have also helped open channels to address other urgent humanitarian concerns, including the fate of detained Ukrainian civilians and abducted children. But progress on a much-needed ceasefire and a lasting peaceful settlement remains painfully slow. Every day of continued fighting undermines the chances for diplomacy to succeed and increases the dangers of further escalation.
Excellencies, as this Council recalled early in the crisis, all Member States have undertaken, under the Charter, the obligation to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. We cannot afford to lose the current diplomatic momentum, as fragile as it might be. The longer this war continues, the more devastating its consequences for everyone. I therefore reiterate my appeal for a full, comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire. A ceasefire that paves the way for a just, comprehensive and lasting peace. A peace that is in line with the United Nations Charter, international law and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations is committed to fully supporting all meaningful efforts to end this war and to build a future of dignity, security and peace for all. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished leaders, representatives of states and governments, and all those who still pay attention to the work of the United Nations. We must admit the world's attention to the UN is fading. The organization has less influence, and too often there is a lack of real decisions on fundamental issues. This is exactly what we need to speak about today, about the tools that sadly are not working now. But they will work, I'm sure. They will work if you are active, if we are active, because the main tool is in your hands. First of all, I thank the Republic of Korea for this meeting of the Security Council and for the opportunity to call for peace. Today, there will be a clear call for peace in this Council. And here is one of the main distortions of our time. Whom must we call to peace, and on whom must we press to achieve it? One of the permanent members of this Council is doing everything to prolong the largest war in Europe since World War II. Russia does this with impunity, using its veto power, buying influence, and keeping peace on hold. The Russian representative is here, but of course not the one who makes the real decisions. That man fears to sit face to face with Ukraine and the world and openly admit he wants only war. Instead, Putin sends delegates who cannot and don't want to stop the bloodshed. And when he appears abroad, in Beijing or somewhere else, it's only to buy more time for killing, pretending he seeks diplomacy. Putin only cares about using every meeting, every chance to keep the war going. Each day, Russia kills our people, destroys our cities, and leaves no sign it will ever return to the principles of the UN Charter. China is also represented here, a powerful nation on which Russia now depends completely. If China truly wanted this war to stop, it could compel Moscow to end the invasion. Without China, Putin's Russia is nothing. Yet too often, China stays silent and distant instead of active for peace. The United States of America is present here as well, a strong nation that supports our defense, and we've said yes to every proposal from the US president for a ceasefire and talks with Russia to bring peace. But Russia always says no, or tries to confuse everyone so that even a ceasefire can't happen. And I met with President Trump just now, and we spoke about how to finally bring peace, and we discussed a few good ideas, and I hope they will work. And I'm grateful for this meeting, and we expect America's actions to push Russia toward peace. Moscow fears America and always pays attention to it. The United Kingdom is here, a permanent member of the Security Council. France is here, also a permanent member. Both nations support us, support our people, our independence. Both promote diplomacy, and both are parties to a document that was supposed to be a positive milestone, together with the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, but instead it became a warning to the world. The Budapest Memorandum, meant to guarantee Ukraine's security in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, failed. It proved that international promises can turn into blabbering. That is why today, with Britain, with France, and already with more than 30 nations in our coalition of willings, we are building a new security architecture. We count on the United States of America as a backstop. Real security guarantees must become the line Russia cannot cross again. Here is one example of how strength can stop war. If we could strengthen our skills with a joint system to shut down skies, with a short system to shut down Russian missiles and drones, it would force Russia to stop its attack from the sky, because everything could be shut down, and so Putin would be forced to sit here or in another respectable venue and look for a truce on the ground. If there is no war in the sky, Russia can't keep fighting on the ground. I have talked about this with President Trump and with other leaders. Why do I say this now and here? Because you, the United States, China, Britain, France, the permanent members of the Security Council, represent the world's essential power, the power that must act when international law alone cannot. And no, not Russia. With this war, Russia has discredited itself, even for those who do not yet criticize Putin openly. They still feel that Russia's presence brings no good. Excellencies, behind every international institution, there must be real strength to enforce decisions. This is true for the Security Council and for the UN as a whole. If you stand together for ending this war, even Russia will have to obey. And if some of you act while others delay, the war goes on. Ukraine wants peace more than anyone in the world. The front is on our land, and we mourn our people, and we try to save our cities and to save our small villages. Russia ignores its dead, blind to its own losses. But one day it will see, and it will hear, and it will happen when it sees your actions, when it hears your united call for peace. That is my appeal to you today. Be the force that act together. Please, united lest to stop Russia's war. And we know how to guarantee security. What we need now is a strong push to force Russia toward peace. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelensky for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. Once again, I thank the Secretary General for his insightful briefing. I welcome the presence of President Zelensky in this meeting, and I also appreciate the participation of other countries in this important discussion. More than 3 years have passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The drone incident along Poland's eastern frontier 2 weeks ago is a reminder that the battlefield may no longer be confined to Ukraine, posing a threat to the peace and security of neighboring states. This conflict has had grave consequences. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure continue in clear violation of international humanitarian law. The humanitarian situation remains severe, with millions of Ukrainians displaced, communities disrupted, and essential services under constant threat. These attacks must end. The Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering commitment to respect for internationally recognized borders, and in particular to upholding the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We also, once again, call for the full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of hostilities. This is essential to prevent further civilian casualties and to create the conditions for dialogue and negotiations. Peace, together with recovery and reconstruction, is essential to alleviating the suffering of Ukrainian civilians. Korea has supported Ukraine in areas such as energy, infrastructure, healthcare, and education, and will continue to consider further measures. Korea also acknowledges the initiatives of the international community, including the adoption of resolutions in both the General Assembly and the Security Council last February, which implore a swift end of the war. Taking note of the ongoing discussions among the US, Russia, and Ukraine and European partners, we hope these efforts will contribute to the realization of a peaceful settlement. Excellencies, we remain gravely concerned about military cooperation between the DPRK and Russia, including transfers of ballistic missiles and arms, as well as troop deployments. These actions constitute clear violations of the UN Charter and of relevant Security Council resolutions unanimously adopted by this body. Such cooperation undermines the global non-proliferation regime, prolongs the conflict in Ukraine, and raises serious security concerns on the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK's involvement demonstrates that this war is not an issue for Europe alone. Its repercussions reach other regions, including Northeast Asia, underscoring the fact that this conflict threatens international peace and security as a whole. We urge both Russia and the DPRK to immediately cease all activities that violate relevant Security Council resolutions. Excellencies, the Security Council carries the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. All members must uphold the credibility of this body by ensuring that violations of international law are not ignored. The international community cannot allow aggression to be legitimized or rewarded. Korea will continue to support international efforts aimed at achieving a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Such peace must be based on the principles of the UN Charter, including respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Only peace founded on these principles will ensure stability for Ukraine and reinforce the rules-based international order that benefits all member states. We will remain actively engaged with partners in pursuit of this goal for the sake of the people of Ukraine. I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, allow me to take this opportunity to thank you for your words today and for your personal engagement on this matter over the past years. Ministers, dear colleagues, I sit here with you today exactly 1 year after I presided over Council meetings on the very same issues, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Reflecting on these two conflicts, I cannot ignore the many troubling similarities they share. In both cases, there is aggression by the Russian Federation in Ukraine and by Israel in Gaza, directed against significantly smaller countries. In both cases, international law is being openly and repeatedly violated. And I must ask, how many more times will we need to gather here before we put an end to these tragedies? Dear colleagues, the war in Ukraine has accompanied my entire tenure as Minister of Foreign and European Affairs. As such, I feel compelled to reflect more deeply on some of its aspects, because I fear that over time, certain elements may have begun to fade from our memories. First, now well into its 4th year, this war continues to escalate. We are witnessing a record number of aerial attacks far from the front lines, causing record numbers of civilian casualties across Ukraine. Second, the rationale behind this war keeps shifting. We've heard justifications ranging from the welfare of Russian minority to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, vague security concerns, and accusations of nationalism within its government. But colleagues, let's remind ourselves, under the UN Charter, none of these reasons provides ground for war. None of them can justify aggression. This is not the first time the Security Council has found itself paralyzed, unable to take meaningful action. But that does not absolve us from our responsibility to protect civilians in armed conflict. Just as this applies to Ukraine, it applies equally to Gaza, Sudan, and to any other region suffering the consequences of war. And as with any protracted conflict, we must continue to confront the facts. We must speak out where condemnation is warranted, because failing to do so is failing to acknowledge reality. and without that, meaningful steps forward are rendered impossible. We condemn the violations of international humanitarian law. We condemn the abductions and forcible transfers of children. We condemn attacks on critical civilian infrastructure. We condemn that Russia keeps responding to Ukraine's calls for peace and ceasefire with drone swarms and missile strikes. We condemn this war of territorial conquest that countries to erode the foundations of the UN Charter and the credibility of this organization. Mr. President, Slovenia believes firmly in the urgent need for a ceasefire and the start of meaningful peace negotiations. These are objectives we know the majority of the Council can support. Slovenia stands ready to work towards a just and lasting peace, one rooted in the principles of the UN Charter. Every nation has the right to shape its own future. Every person deserves to live in peace, dignity, and freedom. And my country will continue to aid the Ukrainian people until they achieve what they deserve. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Fayon for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for the Republic of Korea for convening this meeting and the Secretary General for his briefing. I warmly welcome the participation of President Zelenskyy and his important statement today. Whatever one Council member may claim, there's only one root cause of the war in Ukraine: Russia's illegal invasion of a sovereign UN member state, a blatant violation of the UN Charter, an illegal war of aggression to withdraw borders and take territory by force. But Russia's full-scale invasion was repelled by Ukraine's brave armed forces and with the support of countries opposed to Russia's aggression. But above all, by the determination of Ukraine's people, who refused to lose their independence, to have their national identity erased. With no quick military victory, Russia's leaders switched tactics to terrorize Ukraine into submission. Waves of drones, missiles and bombs hitting civilians and civilian infrastructure, killing the elderly waiting for their pensions, children sleeping in their beds, mothers and babies in maternity wards, rescuers as they search for survivors in the rubble of homes. Daily shocking violations of international law, attacks on the civilian power grid to freeze families in winter, drones used to hunt civilians, sexual assaults, torture and execution of prisoners of war and other detained persons, deporting children. Acts that have been declared war crimes and crimes against humanity by the UN and for which arrest warrants have been issued by the International Criminal Court. And yet, Mr. President, the Kremlin will have us believe it wants peace, that the aggressor somehow is the victim. But Russia's actions speak louder. The 20 largest air attacks on Ukraine's cities have all happened since May, this May. July was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in over 3 years, with more than 1,600 civilians killed or injured. Since the Council passed Resolution 2774, Russia has shown no interest whatsoever at a first step on the path to peace. Russia's leaders clearly mean to prolong and escalate the war. Russia's repeated violation of European sovereign airspace with aircraft and drones underline Russia's insistence of staying on a path of war. These reckless acts threaten the security of our citizens, threatens the regional stability and international peace. Mr. President, for peace to have any chance in Ukraine, the very first step must clearly be for the weapons to fall silent. Ukraine offered an unconditional ceasefire months ago, and we have all witnessed Russia's response: escalation. Therefore, the international community needs to increase the pressure on the Kremlin through additional sanctions and measures against the shadow fleet. This is the only way Russia might engage in the peace talks in good faith. Mr. President, we are also focused on the humanitarian needs and other needs in Ukraine. My own country, Denmark, recently launched the Ukraine Transition Program to enhance Ukraine's resilience and ability to meet its people's urgent basic needs. With a new winter around the corner, Ukraine's needs will increase, and it is our duty to support them. I was in Kiev 10 days ago to launch this program, and I saw the determination of the Ukrainian people with my own eyes. They want to build a future and end this senseless war. We all pledged to uphold the UN Charter, to ensure countries can live in peace within their borders. In the 18th anniversary year of the founding of the UN, any other outcome would be a tragedy. When Denmark was elected to the Security Council, we pledged to uphold international law, and we will continue to do so in all cases. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rasmussen for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, 80 years ago, men and women from all continents signed before history a pact for global peace and security. On the 26th of June, 1945, in San Francisco, the United Nations was born. And in the Charter of the United Nations, these potent words were etched. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. 80 years later, in a sinister echo, Russia is violating the most essential principles of this founding text. Since the 24th of February 2022, it has been perpetrating unjustifiable atrocities in Ukraine. Russia is acting in a lawless way. Vladimir Putin is acting in a lawless way. The International Criminal Court in March 2023 issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin for the deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. Russia was condemned by the General Assembly of the United Nations, a resolution dating March 2022, a resolution dating February 2023, the resolution dating February 2025, and not to mention the resolution dating March 2014. On 9 occasions, the General Assembly denounced the Russian invasion, called for a ceasefire, for the respect of the integrity of Ukraine, and for a just, lasting peace in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Despite all of these condemnations, Vladimir Putin has dug in his heels. Brutality, lies, uninhibited violence. Thousands of Russian and Ukrainian lives have been sacrificed. To what end? To realize an imperialist fantasy, to quench imperial thirst. But frankly speaking, it is clear that Russia has failed. President Trump stated today that it is a paper tiger. Less than 1% of Ukrainian territory has been conquered over the past 1,000 days of war. Civilian Russian economy is flailing, asphyxiated by the war economy and by sanctions, which Vladimir Putin continues to expose his own population to. And in order to mask its failure, the Kremlin has redoubled its violent and aggressive stance. To mask the failure, Vladimir Putin has rained fire on cities of Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. These are martyrized cities, heroic cities. Each night, hundreds of drones and missiles target homes, target schools, target hospitals. Russia has in flagrant breach of international humanitarian law has resulted in tremendous civilian casualties. In order to hide these failures, Vladimir Putin has sought to foment conflict within unacceptable incursions in the airspace of Poland, Romania, and Estonia, hybrid attacks, electoral manipulations, digital attacks which target the democracies of Europe. This will not work. Nothing will cause the Ukrainian spirit of resistance to fail. Nothing will weaken our support for Ukraine. And the principles of the Charter in Russia is making a very significant error if it continues to doubt the unity and the resolution of NATO allies, if it continues to pursue its dangerous escalation on the eastern flank of Europe. On 24 February last, Mr. President, the Security Council, through Resolution 2774, which is tabled by the United States and supported by the Russian Federation, for an end to the conflict as soon as possible. This resolution needs to be implemented in full. We want peace. Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine is only asking for one thing, namely respect for its right to itself determine its future, respect for the right of its people themselves, which is set out under the Charter. These are non-negotiable principles, and it is applicable to Kiev and throughout the world. This is the very principle of the existence of our nations, and it is incumbent upon us as members of the Security Council to uphold this. Mr. President, Russia is lawless. Russia is failing. Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine wants freedom. At this table, and it should have full support. Thank you.
His Excellency, Ms. Baron, for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Yvette Cooper, MP, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the Secretary General for his briefing, and thank you to President Zelensky and Minister Sybiha. The United Kingdom commends you for your leadership and your determination. Thank you too for welcoming me to Kyiv 2 weeks ago, where I saw firsthand the impact of Russia's brutal war. And I met families whose lives had been uprooted, their homes destroyed, their children's education torn apart. But as Putin cynically stalls on peace, I also saw a nation resolute in its fight. And I saw the strength and the courage of the Ukrainian people, the soldiers, civilians, the mothers and fathers, first responders, healthcare workers, who are standing up to defend their homes and their land. Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression is not just a test of Ukrainian resilience and security. It is an assault on the United Nations Charter and its most foundational principles, respect for sovereignty and for territorial integrity, principles on which we all depend every day and feel acutely whenever they are threatened. And it is an assault on the UN Charter by a member of this Security Council. President Zelensky has made clear that he wants peace and wants this war to end, that he and Ukraine have supported a full unconditional ceasefire and reaffirmed his readiness to meet President Putin. Alongside European partners, The US and President Trump are working to support a peace process, but Putin continues to choose war. He has rejected calls for a meaningful ceasefire. He has refused even to meet President Zelensky in a neutral venue. And Putin's strategy includes the forced deportation, indoctrination, and militarization of children. It includes the intensifying of targets against civilians, strikes on Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure, on families as they sleep in their beds at night. Civilian casualties have risen nearly 40%, with children killed in playgrounds, diplomatic premises and government buildings damaged, hospitals and schools destroyed. And these are not accidents of war, they are the result of a cruel strategy targeting the people and communities of Ukraine. But anyone who knows Ukrainians knows that this will never succeed, because their determination to hold on to their freedom, to protect their families, their nation, far exceeds Russia's ability to take those things away. And indeed, what we have seen is Ukraine repeatedly undermine Russia's military goals, so that despite the huge Russian mobilization attempts in the last 3 years, their overall impact on their military goals has been minimal. In this war that they started, their losses are now 20 times higher than were Soviet losses in Afghanistan. In this war that they are continuing to pursue, they are struggling to recruit. And in some areas, their stocks are so low they have resorted to using military equipment from the 1950s. What is this for? Because as Ukraine stands firm against Russia, the United Kingdom stands firm with Ukraine. We know that Ukraine's security is our security, and all of us depend on upholding the UN Charter. We know that Russia exports interference, disinformation and instability well beyond Ukraine, from cyber attacks in Moldova to the deployment of mercenaries in the Sahel. Russia's actions seek to undermine democracies, fuel conflict and spread instability far beyond Europe's borders. And in recent weeks, we've seen provocative and reckless violations of NATO airspace in Estonia, Poland and Romania, against which NATO stands firm, and we will be ready to act. So the UK will continue to stand with Ukraine, providing the support it needs to defend itself now and to rebuild in the future. Rebuilding as a strong, prosperous nation, free to make its own choices. And so I say to the representative of the Russian Federation, we will target your ailing economy, your oil and gas revenues that are paying for this war, the defence industries making your munitions and weapons, because we know the price of war is piling up and the sanctions are falling energy revenues are squeezing the state budget, and oil revenues are now at a 5-year low, but we will go further, be in no doubt. And to our Ukrainian friends, I say, you have the UK's unwavering support now and for decades to come. And to this Council, I simply offer a reminder that 80 years ago, our predecessors came together as United Nations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That mission remains as noble today as it was in 1945. Each generation is tested anew, and we must rise to this test for Ukraine and for us all. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Cooper for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad, and African Affairs of Algeria. Vous avez la parole.
Shukran. Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are meeting once again to recognize with great regret, pain and bitterness the ongoing war that is raging in Ukraine. This war now is going into its 4th year, and we still can't see a solution on the horizon. And in the near future, we can't see any possibility of putting a lasting end to the effects of this war. My country had hopes with regard to the good offices and diplomatic efforts undertaken this year, and which had as their aim putting an end to this war through dialogue and negotiation. This is the only way that will allow the two warring parties to achieve the goal that they wish for. Today, even more than in the past, we would reiterate that these good offices and diplomatic efforts need to be relaunched. We must promote their impact, and in order to close the doors to escalation and the possibility of the conflict further widening in the region. This situation can only have disastrous consequences. The clear disparity between the positions of the two parties on a number of crucial issues must not prevent us from working towards bringing together the differing points of view and to reduce those differences, and also to reach a common ground of understanding that can revive hope with regard to a better future for these two neighbouring countries, and a better future for the European continent, and finally a better future for the whole world. Algeria is one of the countries that is firmly convinced that when we talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war, what we're speaking about is a conflict where all parties are suffering damage and loss, and no party is benefiting. All parties are losing out here. Nobody is winning. Each party is facing considerable negative effects that threaten Europe and the whole world. Bilaterally, this war has cost the two parties, Russia and Ukraine, cost them considerable losses that cannot be measured, losses in human lives, losses in terms of the infrastructure that's been destroyed, and losses with regard to the huge economic, political and social burdens that this war has brought about for both countries. At a regional level, this war has brought the whole European continent into its most serious crisis since the Second World War, in terms of security, politics and the economy, but also in cultural terms. Globally, the repercussions of this war have been felt in all regions of the world without exception. These effects have affected those countries near and far, be that in terms of food security and energy security, or with regard to its harmful effect on international relations, its effect on polarization, deepening divides, and the crisis now affecting the collective security system. All of this has stemmed from this war. For all of these reasons, and for other reasons as well, we reaffirm day by day that ending this war will not only preserve the interests of the parties involved, but solving this war is in the public international interest. And these considerations overall are the background to an initiative urged by the President of Algeria to deploy his good offices between the two parties in the conflict, Russia and Ukraine, on the basis of our historic friendship between Algeria and those that today have become two parties to this conflict. This requires, on our part, intensive work in order to put an end quickly to this war and find a lasting solution and sustainable peace. We are firmly convinced that the momentum of good offices and the diplomatic initiatives must be given priority over military confrontation, so that we can all play our respective roles in contributing to preparing the ground for a fair, lasting, and sustainable solution to this crisis, a political and peaceful solution, because the solution can only be political and peaceful in terms of its approach and its content, a solution that will guarantee that the root causes of the conflict are addressed and that the security interests of the two parties are taken into account. This approach, indeed, is the only one that will be able to provide a lasting and stable solution, which we all long for without delay. And finally, a solution that is based on the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, as well as in international law, because it's those principles that are there to be the arbiter between member states during a dispute. They protect all parties and they preserve the interests of all parties, without any discrimination or favoritism. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Attaf for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hugh Hilton Todd, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please accept my commendations for the Republic of Korea's efficient handling of the Council's business this month. I also like to thank the Secretary General for his valuable perspectives. Mr. President, Excellencies, today's meeting comes at a time when the ongoing war is at a heightened risk of spreading, with violation after violation of the territorial integrity of neighboring states. Guyana rejects the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any nation state. All nations must be free to determine their own destinies as free peoples, including the projection and protection of their interests. We therefore join the international community in reaffirming the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and call for an immediate end to the conflict and attendant violations of international law. We deeply regret that a peaceful resolution is yet to be found and that the repeated calls for good faith negotiations and the cessation of hostilities have not been heeded. Even as Resolution 2774 remains unimplemented, we remain convinced that a peaceful solution is still possible and the only viable path forward. Peace, after all, can never be achieved through force, nor by one side imposing its will upon the other. Genuine and lasting peace requires strong political will, good faith dialogue, and a firm commitment by all involved to sustaining those efforts. Mr. President, Excellencies, as the search for a solution continues, we, the members of the Security Council, must be concerned with the repeated and persistent violations of international law that are taking place. Violations that have placed civilians in Ukraine and Russia squarely at the mercy of combatants. The protections granted to them under international humanitarian law have been stripped away, and they have become victims of deliberate targeting. Their safety and security are imperiled and their vulnerability exploited for military advantage. Moreover, by abducting children, blocking access to humanitarian aid, and attacking critical civilian infrastructure, the damage wrought on civilian lives continues to magnify. The effects of this situation, including the mass destruction of cities and the prolonged economic, social, and psychological impacts, will be acutely felt for years to come. Children have paid particularly high price on account of the violence meted out, especially in the attacks against schools and hospitals. Guyana has always spoken out firmly against such actions and does so again today. We continue to demand that the parties respect humanitarian principles and uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also recognize that ending such violations would require the complete withdrawal by the Russian Federation of its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Mr. President, even as we continue to demand an end to the war, we continue to be confronted with multiple allegations of violations of the airspace of neighboring countries. As we have stated in previous occasions, every member state has a legal obligation to uphold the provisions of the United Nations Charter and to respect the territorial integrity of other states. Guyana calls for an end to the ongoing violations, which risk igniting a broader regional conflict. We have said this many times. Attempts to resolve a conflict through military escalation will only exacerbate the situation and make a peaceful resolution more difficult. At this critical juncture, we call for an urgent ceasefire and for the parties to commit more firmly to peace through dialogue. Resolution 2774 must be implemented. Guyana urges the international community to work in concert to support those efforts. We will continue to do our part as a member of this Council. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Todd for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marco A. Rubio, Secretary of State of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and all of you for convening here today on this important matter. When President Trump took office, he made it among his highest priorities the restoration of peace anywhere and everywhere in the world where the opportunity presented itself. And it's met with great success in a number of places. We had a conflict between India and Pakistan, which was a very dangerous conflict, and one that he chose to engage in and was able to bring it to, be very involved in bringing it to a cessation of hostilities. When Thailand and Cambodia were engaged in hostilities, the President got involved over a weekend over in the United States, and were able to play a critical role in that regard as well. We are very grateful to some of the countries in this room that were helpful in that regard with the DRC and Rwanda, and work remains to be done. But again, a conflict that presents grave dangers and extraordinary humanitarian challenges. With Azerbaijan and Armenia as well. He has become involved, and we were able to sign an agreement at the White House very recently that hopefully prevents a future conflict which would prove costly and deadly. But the one that's proved to be an extraordinary challenge has been the war in Ukraine. between Russia and Ukraine. The President has worked on it tirelessly, has invested a tremendous amount of his own time, energy, and the highest levels of our government. We have had meetings in Turkey, meetings in Saudi Arabia, meetings in Alaska, countless phone calls, doing everything possible to bring this conflict to a resolution and to an end. A war that cannot end militarily. It will end at a negotiating table. That's where this war will end. But the longer it lasts, the more people will die, the more will be destroyed. Some of the numbers we are seeing in the loss of life among military personnel, for example, on the Russian Federation side, are staggering. Staggering in 1 month alone. More loss of life than in the entirety of the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan or Iraq. This war has to end, and we have done everything we possibly can and will continue to do everything we possibly can to bring it to an end. Very generous offers have been made. For example, a ceasefire at the current lines of contact, while all the other details on the future of the conflict could be worked out in terms of future territorial lines. The President has shown extraordinary patience in terms of not assessing additional sanctions in the hopes of having a breakthrough in this regard. And all has come to what appears to be not just a stagnant one, but an era, and we've entered a period of what appears to be potential even escalation, with the historically highest number of strikes we've seen over the last few nights and before. And now we are also watching incursions into neighboring airspace by both drones and airplanes. The President is a very patient man. He's very committed to peace, but his patience is not infinite. And as he has said repeatedly, he has before him the opportunity and the options of imposing additional economic costs on the Russian Federation if necessary in order to bring this to an end. He also has before him the option, as he has already chosen to do in some circumstances, to sell defensive weaponry and potentially offensive weaponry so that Ukraine can defend itself from this assault by purchasing that weaponry. So I'm here to say to the Security Council, the United States remains as committed as it has ever been to a peaceful resolution to this dangerous conflict. But there will come a moment in which we will have to conclude that perhaps there is no interest in a peaceful resolution. And then the President has before him real options, which he intends to pursue, as he has made clear today in some of the messages he has put out. So I strongly urge the Security Council, the member states here, and those who are not part of this as well, to do everything in their power, and including the Russian Federation, to do everything within their power, and the Ukrainian side for that matter as well, but all sides, to bring this war to an end before it becomes something that will last another 3 or 4 years, lead to more destruction, both economic and at the same time and loss of life and loss of property and loss of futures. This war needs to end. But if it does not, if there is no path to peace in the short term, then the United States and President Donald J. Trump will take the steps necessary to impose costs for continued aggression. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rubio for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Alexandra Papadopoulou, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea to the UN for convening this meeting. At a time when the United Nations and its membership should celebrate the 8th anniversary of this organization's founding, the world faces multiple and severe crises, while many countries suffer from the scourge of war. Greece firmly believes that all crises could and should be averted through dialogue and diplomacy. Unfortunately, in the case of unprovoked Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, this defied all diplomatic efforts and resulted in unprecedented loss of human life. For almost 4 years, Europe has experienced the most disastrous war in its territory since World War II. Greece has consistently backed all efforts to put an end to the war in Ukraine. We supported, along with the vast majority of the UN membership, relevant General Assembly resolutions. We assisted this fellow European country in its time of dire need. Above all, we joined our voice with other countries on the need for peace. Greece has welcomed the US-led initiatives and the decisive efforts to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine, firmly believing that the time for peace is long overdue. 3 direct rounds of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have produced some results with regard to the exchange of prisoners and civilian detainees. Greece welcomes these agreements and their implementation and further calls on Russia to engage in goodwill in further negotiations. We regret that Russia has not yet agreed to a leaders' meeting and that it has shifted away from the path to peace, proceeding to reckless acts that affect EU and NATO borders. As a staunch proponent of international law and the UN Charter, Greece unequivocally condemns any violation of internationally recognized territory by land, air or sea. Any change of borders as a result of the use of force is unacceptable and sets a dangerous precedent that could incite armed aggression and imitators elsewhere. We desire peace. As Thucydides has taught us, war is a choice, not an inevitability. We call on Russia to choose peace and cease hostilities. Our primary goal now should be a permanent, comprehensive, just and lasting peace settlement that will be fully in line with international law, the UN Charter, the General Assembly resolutions, and the Helsinki Final Act. As a non-permanent member of this Council, Greece stands ready to work in this direction. Lastly, Greece firmly believes that a peaceful resolution for Ukraine without Ukraine is not possible. We likewise view Europe and its nations as an integral part of any solution to end the war. Together with our European partners, we will continue to prioritize Ukrainian, in other words, European security. To that end, we stress that any future peace agreement should be founded on credible and robust security guarantees to preclude the recurrence of war and ensure an independent, democratic, and sovereign future for Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Mrs. Papadopoulou, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Syed Tariq Fatemi, Special Assistant to the Prime Minister, Minister of State of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Secretary General. I thank the Secretary General for his insightful briefing. I echo his call for peace and the need to bring the protracted conflict in Ukraine to an end. I welcome the Presidents of Ukraine, Greece, France, and Slovenia, as well as the Foreign Ministers of US, UK, and Guyana to this meeting, and the ministers and high-level representatives of other member states. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine has raged on for over 3.5 years. It has impacted the regional and international security landscape. Continued fighting has caused immense human suffering. The repercussions of this conflict extend far beyond its geographical expanse. Increased polarization and geopolitical tensions, disruption of supply chains, food and energy insecurity, global inflation, and much more. The Global South has borne a disproportionate brunt of these consequences. Mr. President, we have consistently maintained that there is no military solution here or in the foreseeable future. Every bullet fired, every rocket and drone launched, every life lost moves us further away from peace. We call upon the parties to demonstrate restraint, scrupulously adhere to the international humanitarian law, and make meaningful strides towards de-escalation. Mr. President, given the complex historical context and the intricate nature of this conflict, the logic of singling out third countries and placing this blame elsewhere is not conducive to the pursuit of peace. Mr. President, a glimmer of hope did emerge at the start of the year to pursue the path of dialogue and diplomacy. The Security Council adopted Resolution 2774, mourning the tragic losses of life, reaffirming the Charter's principle to peacefully settle disputes, imploring a swift and end to the conflict, and urging a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. Pakistan supported this resolution. Pakistan also welcomed the ensuing political engagement, including direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, facilitated by the US President himself. It generated optimism for an early end to this conflict. We certainly hope that these efforts will bear fruit. Our collective priority must be to silence the guns and create conditions for a negotiated settlement. As an ardent advocate for peace and a firm believer in the power of dialogue and diplomacy, we will support all endeavors aimed at resolving the issue peacefully. That was also the spirit of Resolution 2788 adopted by the Council in July. Mr. President, the path of peace is the only responsible choice. A sincere and meaningful dialogue, which addresses the security concerns of all sides, is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter and international law and respects the relevant multilateral agreements, can help secure peace which is both just and sustainable. Pakistan will continue to support all regional and international efforts that pave the way for a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you, sir.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fatemi. Okay. So I thank His Excellency Mr. Fatemi for the statement. Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Javier Martinez Achav Vasquez, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Panama.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Excellencies. Panama would like to thank the Secretary-General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for the information provided regarding the conflict in Ukraine. We welcome the presence of the various countries who join us once again today to address the situation regarding the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion in 2022, Panama has reiterated its concern over the breakdown of international peace and security, as well as the dire consequences of this war, which first and foremost affect the civilian population. We are entering the fourth year of this war, whose origin, stemming from the invasion of a sovereign state, has been the subject of numerous unsuccessful meetings of this Council. In this regard, Panama, respectful of international law, rejects any violation of the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and we condemn the use of force by one state against another. We reaffirm the primacy of these principles, not as a rhetorical exercise or an abstract aspiration, but rather as a moral and legal obligation incumbent upon the entire international community, principles that must be safeguarded and defended wherever they are under threat. The recent violation of the airspace of Poland and Romania, as well as yesterday's meeting called in response to the incursion of Russian combat aircraft into Estonian airspace, are troubling signs of the escalation in the conflict, which undermines the recent diplomatic efforts promoted by the United States with the support of European countries to bring an end to this war. Panama reiterates that dialogue is the only path to the peaceful resolution of this conflict, that with the necessary political will, it is possible to establish the conditions that guarantee respect for international obligations and safeguard peace and security. All of this within a broad framework of freedom and the sovereign equality of states, with full respect for their sovereignty and territorial integrity. This war, the most devastating in Europe since 1945, with a humanitarian crisis that has led to high numbers of civilian and military deaths, injuries, disappearances and displacements, and which has also driven an unprecedented increase in global military spending, this war must come to an end. The effects of this tragedy are not confined to a single region. Its humanitarian, economic and political repercussions are global in nature and are felt in all areas. For 80 years, Panama has upheld the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and in international humanitarian law as essential pillars for peaceful coexistence between peoples. Our country has maintained that respect for these norms is the greatest contribution that we can offer humanity in order to preserve future generations from the scourge of war. Today, we reaffirm the validity of their normative value and the preservation of their integrity and universality as indispensable elements to guarantee the stability of the international order and respect for human rights. For Panama, multilateralism constitutes an indispensable tool for success and an example of effective international cooperation which, from our own experience, we can say has proven its effectiveness in promoting peace, resolving conflicts peacefully, and helping to confront the common challenges of the present and of the future. Mr. President, only with the will of each member state of this Council and the readiness to transform rhetoric into actions for peace can we demonstrate the effectiveness of this United Nations body and our ability to bring peace to peoples suffering the consequences of war. Panama expresses its hope that all parties involved will act with determination to achieve, without delay, a just and lasting peace, one that respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and the human rights of all those people affected. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Acha Vasquez for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. Allow me to make 4 points. First, dialogue and negotiations remain the fundamental path forward. Recently, positive momentum has emerged in the dialogue and negotiations on the Ukraine crisis, with key parties holding a series of engagements and talks. However, significant differences remain in their positions and demands. The parties to the conflict should intensify their efforts, demonstrate political will, show flexibility, and take seriously and address properly each other's legitimate security concerns, so as to reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement at an early date. Second, promoting de-escalation is a pressing priority. At present, there are no signs of a halt to hostilities on the ground, the parties to the conflict continue to carry out large-scale drone and missile attacks, and substantial quantities of arms and ammunition continue to flow into the battlefield. China has consistently called for adherence to the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of the fighting, and no fanning up the flame by any party. We hope all parties will play a constructive role in de-escalating the situation and in creating the necessary conditions for a ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities at an early date. Third, alleviating the humanitarian crisis is a moral imperative. Civilians are the greatest victims of war. Each additional day of conflict brings an additional day of suffering to the people. The parties to the conflict should exercise restraint, strictly abide by international humanitarian law, and refrain under all circumstances from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, and avoid the use of WMDs. The international community should step up its humanitarian assistance efforts in order to help those affected by the crisis overcome their difficulties. Fourth, containing the spillover effects of the crisis is a shared responsibility. The crisis has taken a big toll on global economic development, with developing countries bearing the brunt. The international community should strengthen cooperation on issues such as food, energy, finance, trade, and the protection of critical infrastructure in order to jointly maintain the stability and smooth functioning of global supply chains. Abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction under the pretext of the crisis does not contribute to a political settlement. On the contrary, it creates new problems and should therefore be rejected. President, since the first day of the crisis, China has been upholding an objective and impartial position, calling for a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, and advocating for peace talks towards a political settlement. Guided by the four shoulds put forth by President Xi Jinping, we have maintained close communication with parties concerned, sent our special envoys for shadow diplomacy and
发起成立乌克兰危机和平之友小组，汇聚和平呼声，促进和平共识，推动和平努力。中方愿同国际社会一道，继续为推动危机的早日政治解决发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank you for convening this briefing on Ukraine at the request of Slovenia, Denmark, Greece, France, and the United Kingdom. I welcome President Volodymyr Zelensky's participation at this meeting. I thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive and sobering briefing. We also welcome the participation of ministers from neighboring countries in this meeting. For nearly 4 years, this Council has called for an end to a conflict that continues to inflict devastating harm on civilians and critical infrastructure. Since 2022, nearly 14,000 civilians, including over 700 children, have been killed and more than 35,000 injured. Sierra Leone has consistently condemned the disregard for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes enshrined in the UN Charter. Article 2.3 obliges member states to resolve their disputes by peaceful means while refraining from the threat or use of force. The neglect of these principles and international law in this conflict is troubling, as is the repeated use of force and the Council's failure to secure a ceasefire. This conflict will not be resolved on the battlefield, but through a negotiated ceasefire and peace agreement that addresses the legitimate concerns of the parties. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, I wish to make the 4 points. First, international humanitarian law must be respected. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, whether in Ukraine or Russia, violate the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction. Second, the conflict's toll on children and women is particularly grave. Thousands of children have been killed, injured, or traumatized, while many women face disproportionate impacts on their livelihoods. We call for the immediate return of Ukrainian children and women's inclusion in peace and recovery processes. Third, humanitarian needs remain immense. Over 12 million people require assistance, with millions displaced internally and across Europe. The destruction of infrastructure, contamination of land by mines, and the onset of winter make unhindered humanitarian access and sustained funding more urgent than ever. Fourth, good faith ceasefire and peace negotiations must be pursued. Confidence-building measures such as prisoner exchanges and the return of children should be built upon. We commend the efforts of Turkey in this regard. We are concerned by violations of the airspace of Poland, Romania, and Estonia, which risk wider escalation. The Security Council must support political dialogue to prevent regional conflagration. The conflict has already severely disrupted global economic supply chains, resulting in shortages and price increases of critical food and fuel supplies. Mr. President, Sierra Leone continues to call for dialogue and diplomacy in line with Article 33 of the Charter as the only path to a just and sustainable peace. We urge negotiations toward a peaceful settlement that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity while addressing the legitimate security concerns of all parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Secretary General for his briefing on the worrying developments in Ukraine and the wider region. We meet today as the war in Ukraine enters yet another difficult chapter and a conflict whose origins stretch back years and whose consequences have rippled far beyond its borders. The latest developments only reinforces the urgency and complexity of the crisis. In that regard, I would like to make the following points. First, we are deeply troubled by the ongoing escalation of attacks impacting civilians and essential civilian infrastructure. Hospitals, schools, and homes must never become casualties of war. Protecting civilians, particularly the most vulnerable among them, and preserving essential infrastructure are obligations enshrined under international law. Our delegation reiterates that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. Second, we must acknowledge that there can be no military solution to this conflict. My delegation welcomes the ongoing peace efforts spearheaded by President Trump to bring an end to this protracted conflict. We believe that every opportunity for peace and diplomacy, however brief, must be seized and built upon. We take note of the upcoming planned meeting between President Trump of the United States and Ukrainian President Zelensky on the sideline of the United Nations General Assembly, which we hope will advance dialogue and diplomacy. We also commend the humanitarian mediation efforts, including prisoners of war exchanges, and progress on these issues can build the trust necessary for broader engagement. Third, we are concerned by the recent reported military developments in the wider Eastern European region, which could escalate into a broader war in the region. These incidents underscore the escalating nature of the conflict and highlight the urgent need for a comprehensive de-escalation and utmost restraint by all parties to prevent a wider conflagration. Constructive and good faith engagement remain essential, and only through sustained diplomatic efforts and willingness to compromise can bring durable and just peace be achieved. Mr. President, in closing, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all efforts aimed at addressing the root causes of the conflict and achieving a just and lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this crisis deserve a future and a path to peace founded upon peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Председатель, крайние члены Совета Безопасности вынуждены сегодня тратить время и присутствовать на заседании, инициированном нашими европейскими коллегами, исключительно по случаю очередных нью-йоркских гастролей одного всем нам известного бывшего актера. По этому случаю их здесь набилось как в метро в час пик, и каждое выступление, которое мы услышали и услышим, лишь перепевает предыдущие и не имеет никакого отношения к правде. Никакой добавленной стоимости для дела установления мира на Гuyане, разумеется, не принесет. И станет лишь очередным позорным эпизодом той ярмарки лицемерия, которая представляет собой подачу украинской тематики европейскими государствами. Европейские спонсоры режима Зеленского хотят, чтобы Совет Безопасности ООН жил, как и они, в некой параллельной реальности, в которой Украина не проигрывает на поле боя, теряя город за городом, а украинские граждане выстраиваются в очередь за тем, чтобы погибнуть в бессмысленной мясорубке за западные геополитические интересы. В этой извращенной картине, которую нам сегодня пытаются навязать, Украина – это островок демократии и свободы, а ее лидер-узурпатор, нарушивший все свои предвыборные обещания и бросивший в застенки тысячи сограждан, пользуется поддержкой всех украинцев, которые и в выборах необходимости, раз у них такой преступной манипуляции, цель которой – не допустить долгосрочного, справедливого и устойчивого мира на Украине, подразумевающего в том числе выработку таких гарантий безопасности, которые исключили бы угрозу нового конфликта в Европе. Это, по сути, сговор, направленный на то, чтобы украинцы по-прежнему тысячами погибали в бессмысленной братоубийственной бойне, которую западные недруги России готовили много лет, рассчитывая обескровить нашу страну, подорвать ее безопасность и экономический потенциал. За скобками при этом сознательно оставляются вопиющие для любого цивилизованного государства уродливые явления, которое не потерпело бы ни в своей стране, ни по соседству ни одно уважающее себя правительство. Нам всем, в частности, предлагается закрыть глаза на то, что обезумевшие от русофобии и вседозволенности своих сюзеренов киевские марионетки и не думают отказываться от гонений на русскоязычных граждан Украины, запрещая им, вопреки Конституции собственной страны, говорить на родном языке и учить ему своих детей. У нас на глазах людей под страхом смерти и преследований заставляют отказаться от своей идентичности, от своих духовных и исторических корней. А все так называемые европейские демократии этому рукоплещут, безосновательно утверждая, что Россия якобы хочет растоптать идентичность украинскую. У нас никогда не было такой задачи. Это огромная наглая ложь, продвигаемая киевским князьком для запугивания и оболванивания мировой общественности. Нам предлагается забыть, как обнаглевший от безнаказанности ненацистский режим в Киеве, пришедший к власти в результате спонсированного Западом нарушения устава ООН госпереворота, расстреливал беззащитных людей на юге и востоке Украины из танков и орудий, сбрасывал на них бомбы и заживо сжигал в Одесском доме профсоюзов, унижал и издевался над ними только за то, что они русские, и отказались принимать человеконенавистническую идеологию киевского режима. А потом его 7 лет под ширмой минских договоренностей вооружали до зубов, снабжали разведданными и готовили к войне с Россией, как в этом признался ряд отставных европейских политиков, имевших к этому непосредственное отношение. А еще нас призывают не замечать, как на Украине по-прежнему возвеличивают тех, кто в годы Второй мировой войны вместе с нацистами уничтожил сотни тысяч евреев, поляков, русских, цыган, тех же украинцев. Как европейские партнеры Киева стыдливо опускают глаза, когда видят на телах обучаемых ими националистических украинских боевиков свастики и другие нацистские и ненацистские символы, которые запрещены в их собственных странах. Господин председатель, для тех, кто пытается заставить весь мир мыслить в этой извращенной парадигме, история начинается лишь в феврале 2022 года. Они не хотят вспоминать о нарушенных обещаниях не допустить расширения НАТО на восток и о неделимости безопасности. Хотят стереть из памяти то, что они сотворили в Киеве в 2014 году. Выдергивают из устава ООН один единственный принцип об уважении территориальной целостности государств, забывая об их суверенном равенстве, о невмешательстве в их внутренние дела и о праве народов на самоопределение. Они видят проблему только в действиях, которые стали ответом на их собственные шаги. На ходу подменяют международное право так называемым порядком, основанным на правилах, которые они сами же придумывают и навязывают другим. Украинский кризис – это прямой результат их действий и их шагов, предпринимавшихся много лет, несмотря на все наши предупреждения и призывы остановиться и сойти с курса, который ведет к катастрофе для этой страны. Сегодня же, когда эта катастрофа очевидна всем, кроме разве что спасающего свою шкуру и свои наворованные миллиарды главаря киевского режима и тех, кто привел его к власти, они пытаются подорвать усилия, нацеленные на установление долгосрочного и устойчивого мира на Украине. Название этой страны стало нарицательным не только для поголовной коррупции и тотального бесправия, но и для вопиющих двойных стандартов, которые коллективный Запад и подконтрольные ему СМИ демонстрируют в украинском контексте. Нигде в мире, ни в одном конфликте так последовательно не игнорируются бесспорные нарушения международного гуманитарного права со стороны киевского режима, использующего мирных жителей в качестве живого щита и размещающего средства ПВО в непосредственной близости от жилых кварталов. Это приводит к трагедиям, связанным с падениями на жилые дома обломков или промахнувшихся противовоздушных ракет, которых в иной ситуации не случилось бы, поскольку ВКС России, как уже неоднократно подчеркивалось, наносит исключительно высокоточные удары по объектам, относящимся к военно-промышленному потенциалу киевского режима. Кроме того, в большинстве случаев они являются ответом на удары украинских беспилотников по мирным объектам в российских городах, целенаправленные обстрелы укронацистов жилых домов, школ, детских садов и больниц, которые на Западе пытаются не замечать. К сожалению, им в этом подыгрывают и в секретариате ООН, где энергично подхватывают любые утверждения из Киева и игнорируют печальную статистику, озвучиваемую российскими властями. Видим в этом вопиющее нарушение статьи 100 Устава ООН, предписывающей сотрудникам Всемирной организации беспристрастность. Чести Антонио Гутеррешу и его подчиненным подобная линия не делает. Господин председатель, всем нам сегодня понятно, что в ЕС и НАТО сильно влипли с антироссийским украинским проектом, запутались и заврались, и не очень представляют, как выпутаться из ситуации, в которой сами себя загнали. Раньше всех начали прозревать в Вашингтоне после прихода к власти новой американской администрации. Однако, вместо того, чтобы присоединиться к усилиям, направленным на установление мира, в Брюсселе и союзных столицах по-прежнему, по инерции или сознательно, раскручивают маховик войны, последовательно и без каких-либо оснований лепят из России образ врага, который неминуемо на них нападет, стоит ему только разделаться с Украиной. Сегодня эта партия войны потеряла сон, всячески стараясь подорвать итоги и понимания, достигнутые в ходе встречи президентов России и США на Аляске месяц назад. Закатывает истерики, в том числе и в этом зале, в связи с бездоказательными утверждениями то о залете в Польшу якобы российских беспилотников, то о якобы пролете над Эстонией российских истребителей. Подобная промывка мозгов и зомбирование населения, стремление повесить на Россию свои недоработки и ошибки и острейшие экономические и социальные проблемы, с которыми столкнулись европейские общества в результате собственных непродуманных санкционных мер, сравнимы разве что с обработкой немецких и итальянских обывателей накануне Второй мировой войны. А потом все эти манипуляторы, получив очередной горький урок истории, будут разводить руками и утверждать, что они осознавали последствия своих действий. Обнадеживает, что не все в Европе готовы следовать этим губительным путем. И появляется все больше политических сил и лидеров, которые отвергают войну и конфронтацию в Европе и агитируют за развитие взаимовыгодных и равноправных отношений с Россией. Мы выступали за такой сценарий с самого начала. Господин председатель, контуры будущего мира на Украине нам всем понятны. Как очевидно и то, что представления киевского режима о том, как он мог бы выглядеть, не имеют никакого отношения к реальности. И лишь обрекают новые тысячи не желающих отправляться на фронт украинских граждан на бессмысленную гибель. Только вчера в эфире одного из украинских каналов один из тамошних пропагандистов посетовал, что у украинцев на улицах отлавливают много, но они, цитирую, быстро заканчиваются. В этом циничном заявлении вся суть киевского режима. Вы подписываетесь вместе с ним над подобной незавидной участью оставшихся в живых граждан Украины? Если да, то нам не о чем с вами разговаривать. Если же вам они не безразличны, мы ждем вашей поддержки и искренней работы вместе с теми, кто пытается нащупать контуры реалистичного, долгосрочного и устойчивого мира, который остановил бы эту войну, начатую преступной киевской кликой в 2014 году. Мы не отказываемся ни от каких переговорных форматов, но выступаем исключительно за серьезный, субстантивный и незашоренный разговор. Не отказываемся мы и от переговоров с Украиной, несмотря на крайне сомнительную, мягко говоря, легитимность ее нынешних властей. Оптимальный формат для этого уже найден. Это переговорная площадка в Стамбуле. Обо всем остальном можно будет говорить только после того, как там будут достигнуты значимые экспертные наработки. Пока до этого еще, к сожалению, далеко. Господин председатель, в завершении хотел бы напомнить о пророческих словах, произнесенных на полях недели высокого уровня Генассамблеи 2 года назад польским президентом Анджеем Дудой. Цитирую: «Украина, как утопленник, тянет нас всех на дно». Конец цитаты. Сегодня подобными утопленниками стали уже очень многие из тех, кто выступил в этом зале. Если вас устраивает такая бесславная участь, можете ничего не делать и продолжать в том же духе. Если же нет, то работы предстоит много. Мы к ней были и есть готовы. Теперь ваш черед сделать этот выбор. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Petro Pavel, President of the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, it is an honor to address again the Security Council, and I thank the Korean Presidency for this opportunity. The Czech Republic is proud to be among the founding nations of this esteemed organization and remains fully committed to upholding the Charter and the rules-based international order. For more than 11 years, these principles have been under direct assault by Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine, which continues to suffer daily attacks against civilians, infrastructure, and even foreign diplomatic mission. Russia, for everyone to see, does not seek a peace. Let me state it loud and clear that Russia continues to violate basic principles of the UN Charter, territorial integrity and national sovereignty through its naked attempt to land grab and expansion of sphere of influence. The recent land swap proposals and continued military escalation highlight its disregard for peace and international law. While Russia pretends readiness for dialogue and negotiating process, it systematically breaches the very basic principles of peaceful coexistence among the nations and continues to play for time. And it will continue to do so for as long as the international community allows it. We condemn in the strongest terms possible the recent incursion of Russian drones into Polish airspace. And it was not an isolated incident. It forms part of Russia's deliberate strategy to intimidate its neighbors and test the limits of international law. Czechia stands in full solidarity with Poland, Estonia or Romania and commends their swift and decisive defensive response in the face of this blatant act of aggression. After many years of war, Ukrainians are the ones who want peace in their country the most. Therefore, Ukraine must be a key actor at the peace talks. Any peace agreement must be based on international law, including the UN Charter, and be subject to Ukraine's consent. The aggressor must not be rewarded for unlawful use of force. Accountability and full reparations for the damage caused are essential for a just and lasting peace. Ladies and gentlemen, there can be no doubt Russia's aggressive behavior cannot be appeased. It must be faced with strength and a resolute global response. We call on all members of the international community, and in particular on China, to assume their responsibility and stop enabling this divisive war of aggression, which risks escalating further and undermining global peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank His Excellency Mr. Pavel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Peter Pellegrini, President of the Slovak Republic.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first I want to thank the Republic of Korea for putting Ukraine on the agenda of this week's Security Council meeting. As a neighboring country, Slovakia is very concerned about the situation in Ukraine. Even though Slovakia and Republic of Korea are geographically distant, we both recognize the wide-ranging effects of this war. Its consequences extend beyond Ukraine and affect global peace, security and justice. 80 years ago, the UN Charter was created to prevent anyone from imposing their will on their sovereign neighbors or taking territory by force. We must stand firmly against such actions. We have given the Security Council the important responsibility to maintain peace and security and to uphold the Charter. Yet, the war in Ukraine has been ongoing for over 1,300 days. This is not just a European issue. It concerns us all. For a long time, we believed that meetings like this would not be necessary. We must consistently defend the UN Charter to ensure that such behavior does not happen again in the future, anywhere in the world. It is our duty to do everything we can to end this conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, as a country with a war right at our border, Slovakia sees the heavy toll it takes: civilian casualties, destruction of infrastructure, and violations of humanitarian law. This war has serious implications for my region and European security. Despite direct talks between President Trump and President Putin in Alaska, there has been no ceasefire or peace agreement. Although there were hopes for diplomatic talks and negotiations, the war continues. Russia refuses to stop fighting, forcing Ukraine to defend itself, its people, and its borders. Recently, there have been troubling incidents involving our allies. Just 2 weeks ago, Russian drones violated the airspace of Poland, our neighbor and ally. I want to express my strong support and solidarity with Poland, as well as with Estonia and Romania. An open door to negotiations should not be seen as a weakness or a call for more violence. It is not surprising that measures are being taken in response to threats to our shared security. Slovakia has consistently called for a quick and peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine, including direct talks with Ukraine, the country most affected. We are ready to help and support guarantees
for a lasting peace that aligns with the UN Charter and resolutions. President Trump has tried to step up and to move from discussions to actions, and he is still trying. The whole international community should continue to pursue peace resolutions to the war in 3 points. First, end of fighting. Second, mediated negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for a peace agreement. And 3, security guarantees for Ukraine, those that would sustain the cause of peace in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, His Excellency Mr. Pellegrini, for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alexander Stubb, President of the Republic of Finland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm addressing the Security Council on behalf of the Nordic states, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and Finland. And I'm probably given the honor to do this because Finland shares a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia. Now, the Security Council has had Ukraine on its agenda for the last 11 years, with a few results on paper and even less on the ground. At the same time, it's quite clear that the General Assembly has overwhelmingly, on several occasions, condemned the aggression of Russia. The Council was entrusted with the primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and I think it's quite safe to say that we have failed in that. Ordinary Ukrainian civilians, and actually Russians as well, are paying a high price for this. Now, quite often I hear words that we need to eradicate the root cause of this war. The root cause is very simple. And the root cause is that Russia is not abiding by this, the UN Charter. It's really as simple as that. It is trying to violate the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, the UN Charter lays out the principles that underpin multilateralism. These principles, in my mind, are universal. Every country has taken a sovereign decision to uphold them when joining the UN. They are the minimum common rules at the core of the whole international system. We heard that in a speech from the Secretary General today, and we heard it from the President of the General Assembly. Now, the prohibition of the use of force, sovereign equality, and territorial integrity are fundamental to our coexistence. These rules are violated daily by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Russia's war of aggression violates the very essence of who we are. It violates the very essence of the UN Charter. If we allow borders to be changed by the use of force, it will set a precedent with global implications. And I look around the room here today, I think most of us have had the experience throughout our history of war as a means of expansion. We've either been the victims thereof or we've been the aggressor. And I always felt that after 1945, we should have all learned our lesson. And many of us probably believed that after 1989, that lesson had been learned and we'd be moving towards some kind of eternal peace. But the truth is that when we don't nurture the international institutions that are the foundations of the peace, like the United Nations, we fail. I think a just peace is in our shared interests, and the solution is quite simple. It's in 2 phases. The first phase is a ceasefire. Ukraine has accepted it. The United States has proposed it. Europe supports it. But there's only one country that doesn't want a ceasefire, and that is Russia. And the second phase is very simple. You go into peace negotiations. And peace negotiations can last a long time. But they are, indeed, the only way we can get out of this. It's in our interest to ensure that the peace is sustainable and without a relapse. President Zelensky has repeatedly called for a ceasefire and high-level negotiations, and Moscow's response has been more missiles and drones. I think the message to my Russian colleagues around this table is it's time to talk about peace. There are too many people dying as a cause of this conflict. I personally think that today could be a game changer for many reasons. One of them was President Trump's post on Truth Social, which I didn't think left any space for interpretation. It was a clear message that it's time to end this war. And I think Secretary Rubio noted that President Trump is running out of patience. Now, of course, Russia is not operating alone, so we urge all states directly or indirectly supporting the invasion to stop. We live in an era with increasing geopolitical tension and hardening rhetoric in international relations. I think we need to be clear. Might does not make right. Borders cannot be moved by force. Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and Sevastopol are Ukrainian. Membership in this council comes with power, but it also comes with responsibility. Please use that power to stop the killing and pave the way for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, for the sake of all of us. And let me finish by quoting my mentor, President Martti Ahtisaari, who was a big friend of the United Nations and received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. He said that what humans begin, they can also end. Please end this war. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Stubb for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Alar Karis, President of the Republic of Estonia.
President of the Security Council, Excellencies, I speak on behalf of Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We thank the Presidency for convening us at this crucial moment for international peace and security. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes one of the gravest breaches of international law and the UN Charter since its adoption 80 years ago. Despite repeated calls by the General Assembly to stop the aggression, Russia continues its brutal assault on the Ukrainian nation, which began with the illegal occupation of annexation of Crimea in 2014 and continued with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This is totally incompatible not only with the status and responsibilities of a permanent member of a Security Council, but also with those of any UN member state. The scale of human tragedy Russia has inflicted in Ukraine is unimaginable. Millions of homes have been destroyed and families torn apart. Tens of thousands of children have been abducted and deported to Russia, subjugated through so-called re-educational programs with their roots and identity are systematically erased. We continue to call on Russia to grant full access for the UN and independent monitors to the occupied territories, to the prisoner of war camps in Russia, and to the areas under occupation. Russia must return the deported children. Russia must release all civilian detainees. In response to the recent peace effort by the United States, Russia has only intensified its campaign of terror against Ukrainians. Russia has not held back even from targeting and damaging diplomatic facilities in clear violation of the Vienna Convention. The recent violations of Estonian, Polish and Romanian airspace by Russia are yet another escalation and a stark reminder that Russia's aggression threatens not only Ukraine, but the security of the entire region. On Monday, the Emergency Security Council meeting was convened to discuss the grave violation of Estonia's territorial integrity by Russian armed fighter jets. Allow me to thank all 50-plus countries who called out Russia's action as dangerous, reckless, and in violation of international law. President, Russia is not interested in peace and security, neither in Ukraine nor in Europe. In March 2025, President Zelenskyy agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal. That was 6 months ago. Russia, on the other hand, has shown no intention of agreeing to a ceasefire, let alone a lasting peace. Russia's objective remains unchanged: subjugation of all the Ukraine and the reshaping of European security order to satisfy Russia's own neo-colonial and imperial ambitions. The only viable way forward towards a ceasefire and ultimately towards lasting peace in Ukraine is to collectively increase international pressure to force Russia to just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Ukrainians have courageously defended not only the country, but the core principles enshrined in UN Charter: sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. These principles are non-negotiable and cannot be compromised, as they form the very foundation of international law-based multilateral system. The Baltic states' message is clear. Russia and its leadership must be held accountable for the crime of aggression, for the war crimes and crimes against humanity. There can be no lasting peace without accountability. Without accountability, there can be no justice. And without justice, there cannot be lasting peace. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. In accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine has the inherent right to defend itself against Russia's armed aggression. Defending Ukraine's freedom means for us defending the sovereign equality of all member states, large and small, the core principles of which the United Nations was founded. We call on the Security Council to act. The cost of inaction is borne not only by Ukraine, but by the credibility of the international community as a whole. We urge all UN member states to increase pressure on Russia by strengthening sanctions or providing greater political, military and humanitarian support to Ukraine. Impunity, appeasement and further concessions would only embolden the aggressor and would lead to new crimes and escalation by Russia. Therefore, it remains our common duty to support Ukraine in its legitimate pursuit of comprehensive, just and lasting peace, a peace rooted firmly in international law. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Karas for the statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Costa, President of the European Council.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank South Korea Presidency to convey this meeting. Ukraine is fighting for the very principles of the United Nations Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, the respect of the international recognized borders, the right to choose its own destiny. We cannot rewrite history. This war started with an unjustified and illegal attack by Russia. There is the only one root cause to this war: Russia's refusal to accept Ukraine's right to choose its own future. Peace in Ukraine is not just Ukraine's interest, is not just Europe's interest. It is the interest of the global community. If we accept Russia's invasion of Ukraine, no country will ever be safe. The pursuit of peace must be the top priority of the global community. The European Union will continue to work to end this war of aggression and to support Ukraine in every way. A ceasefire, to which Ukraine has already agreed to, is the first step. And I call on Russia, a permanent member of this Security Council, to agree to come to the negotiation table, to stop the killings, to stop the destruction, to stop threatening the neighboring countries. I call on the international community to be actively engaged on peace efforts in full respect of the United Nations Charter. The European Union supports President Trump's efforts for peace. And I would like to see China, also a permanent member of the Security Council, contribute towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, to achieve an end to the aggression, the European Union will continue to apply pressure on Russia through sanctions. To ensure a lasting peace, the European Union, in the context of the coalition of the willing, is ready to contribute with concrete security guarantees to Ukraine and to fulfill the aspirations of Ukraine people. We will continue to support Ukraine on its path to full membership in the European Union. Mr. President, the time for peace, it's now, and it is now time for Russia to stop this aggression. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Costa for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Pedro Sanchez Perez Castejon, President of the Government of Spain.
Excelencias, distinguidos colegas, señoras y señores, agradezco a la presidencia coreana haber convocado esta sesión sobre Ucrania, porque una de las prioridades del Consejo de Seguridad tiene que ser que la paz llegue a Ucrania de una vez por todas. Y lamentablemente, tras 3 años y medio de conflicto, seguimos atrapados en la misma encrucijada, sin avances significativos hacia una solución duradera. Ya se ha dicho en reiteradas ocasiones, pero creo que es importante no olvidarlo, la agresión rusa contra Ucrania constituye una violación inaceptable del derecho internacional y de los valores compartidos por el conjunto de la comunidad internacional. Esta agresión es especialmente alarmante porque ha sido perpetrada por un miembro permanente de esta sala, del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas, el órgano encargado, supuestamente, de velar por la paz y por la estabilidad global. Si permitimos que la fuerza y la coacción sustituyan al diálogo y al respeto mutuo entre naciones, estaremos sentando un peligroso precedente que pondrá en riesgo la estabilidad de las fronteras y también del orden internacional, especialmente en Europa, pero también en otras regiones del mundo. Permítame subrayar con la mayor claridad que cualquier acuerdo de paz que se alcance debe estar firmemente anclado en el respeto al derecho internacional y a la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Por tanto, no se pueden aceptar soluciones que impliquen la legitimación de la violencia o la alteración por la fuerza de las fronteras reconocidas internacionalmente. Si renunciamos a estos principios, no solo estaremos traicionando la confianza de los pueblos que representamos, sino que estaremos abriendo la puerta a nuevas crisis y a conflictos en el futuro. En el caso de mi país, de España, desde el primer día hemos sido una firme defensora de la libertad y la seguridad de Ucrania. Formamos parte de la coalición de voluntarios, hemos enviado miles de millones de euros a Kiev en ayuda militar, también humanitaria. Hemos entrenado a más de 8.000 soldados ucranianos y hemos acogido a más de 240.000 desplazados ucranianos en nuestro país. Y Ucrania ha demostrado, además, miembros del Consejo de Seguridad, en reiteradas ocasiones su disposición a comprometerse con un alto el fuego y a buscar una solución negociada a esta guerra. Sin embargo, la respuesta del presidente de la Federación Rusa, de Putin, ha sido una y otra vez la escalada de la violencia, el lanzamiento de nuevos ataques, ignorando el llamamiento de la comunidad internacional y agravando el sufrimiento de una población, la población civil, inocente. Los recientes bombardeos dirigidos deliberadamente contra la población civil en Ucrania, las infraestructuras esenciales como hospitales, escuelas, redes eléctricas, redes de suministro de agua, son una prueba clara de que Rusia no tiene en este momento voluntad alguna de llegar a la paz con Ucrania. Las violaciones del espacio aéreo europeo de estos últimos días son absolutamente inaceptables y la comunidad internacional debe actuar con determinación y con unidad, utilizando todos los instrumentos políticos que tenemos a nuestro alcance, los diplomáticos, los humanitarios, para poner fin a esta tragedia y sentar las bases de una solución sostenible. Durante esta semana de alto nivel, reafirmemos juntos nuestro compromiso con la paz, con la justicia y el respeto al derecho internacional, porque no podemos permitir que la indiferencia o el cansancio nos paralicen. Debemos recordar que la defensa de la legalidad internacional, de los derechos humanos, repito, de los derechos humanos, es una responsabilidad compartida y que solo a través de la solidaridad y la cooperación podremos garantizar un futuro seguro y digno a las generaciones venideras. Muchas gracias.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sánchez Pérez Castejón for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Rick Frieden, Prime Minister of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and my own country, Luxembourg. I thank the colleagues, Prime Ministers of Belgium and the Netherlands, to be here with me to underline the importance we as Benelux countries attach to the peace and security in Ukraine. For over 3 years now, we and the overwhelming majority of United Nations member states have been calling on Russia to end its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia must stop this war immediately, as already stated forcefully also by the International Court of Justice in March 2022. In this war, Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine has a legitimate right to defend itself in line with Article 51 of our UN Charter. Last February, this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. As a permanent member of this Council, Russia has a special responsibility to uphold the UN Charter, international law, and global stability. In reality, Russia is challenging the very principles of the United Nations. Therefore, Russia's aggression not only undermines Ukraine's security and Europe's security as a whole, it affects the entire international community. Mr. President, for years, the people of Ukraine have bravely stood up against daily indiscriminate bombings and killings by Russia's armed forces. Countless civilians have died. Entire neighborhoods and cities have been destroyed. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been abducted. These kits must be brought back immediately. The Benelux countries reiterate their strongest possible condemnation of this war started by President Putin. Our message to Russia remains clear and simple. Stop attacking Ukraine and withdraw your troops. The Benelux countries underline their unwavering support for Ukraine. We remain steadfast in our support for comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with our Charter. Any peace must be just, not imposed, not partial, and not forgetting the victims and the suffering endured. There must be accountability for all the crimes committed. We welcome the peace efforts led by President Trump. Despite intense diplomacy by the United States, Ukraine, the European Union, and other partners, however, there are no signs that Russia's goal of subjugating Ukraine has changed. On the contrary, while Ukraine has repeatedly stated its readiness for an immediate ceasefire and for meaningful peace negotiations, Russia keeps targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Russia's reckless behavior was evident in the last 2 weeks when it repeatedly violated NATO airspace. These dangerous provocations, which are violating international law, demonstrate that if Russia's aggression remains unchecked, it is bound to repeat itself and expand. Mr. President, the relentless war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation has only strengthened our resolve. With our allies and partners, the Benelux countries will continue to pursue coordinated political, military, humanitarian and financial support to Ukraine in order to bolster its efforts to defend itself, rebuild the country and pursue a just peace. To our Ukrainian friends, we reiterate our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and our full solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine in their fight for freedom. And to Russia, we say, it's time to stop this war, for peace, for your children and ours. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Frieden for the statement. And I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Tajani, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Republic of Italy.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The Italian goal is very clear: a just and lasting peace. Our priority is the respect of the international law. We stand, of course, with Ukraine, fighting to defend their freedom and sovereignty. This is a key priority at the United Nations, in the G7 and in the European Union. I want to make this point very clear. We are not at war with Russia. Our goal is to bring Russia to the negotiation table for a just peace. We are fully convinced that a path to peace is still possible. Like Pope Leo said, we cannot abandon the hope for peace. We fully support the efforts of President Trump to reach a negotiated and fair solution to the conflict. To this end, we urge Russia to cease its attack and follow up on the summit in Alaska. It is time to start direct negotiation with Ukraine. Italy strongly supports this political process. We all need to support it. This is the key to end this conflict. Je souhaite maintenant m'adresser directement à mes collègues des pays partenaires. Il est temps d'unir nos efforts en vue d'une paix juste. Vous trouvez toujours une oreille attentive à Rome. En même temps, nous espérons que la Russie pourra bientôt envoyer des signes concrets de coopération. Dans ce contexte, les récentes violations de l'espace aérien polonais, roumain et estonien sont inacceptables. Ce sont de mauvais signaux, mais nous devons éviter l'escalade. Nous restons préoccupés par la sécurité de la centrale nucléaire de Zaporijia. Nous devons continuer à soutenir les efforts du directeur général de l'AIEA, M. Grossi.
toute solution durable au conflit doit inclure de solides garanties de sécurité pour l'Ukraine. Il est également essentiel qu'aucune décision concernant l'Ukraine ne soit prise sans l'Ukraine. L'avenir de l'Ukraine est dans l'Unión Europea. Italia está en primera línea en la reconstrucción de Ucrania. La conferencia para la recuperación de Ucrania que organizamos en Roma en julio recaudó más de 10.000 millones de euros. Desde Roma enviamos un mensaje al mundo. Creemos en el futuro de Ucrania, todos juntos. Seguiremos prestando especial atención al patrimonio cultural de Ucrania. Un ejemplo, Italia contribuirá a reconstruir los monumentos emblemáticos de Odessa. Lo haremos poniendo a disposición nuestras mejores excelencias. También debemos poner en el centro la dimensión humanitaria de la guerra. Este es un mensaje muy fuerte que me reafirmó personalmente el Papa León en un encuentro oficial hace pocas semanas. La paz significa también justicia. Debemos garantizar la rendición de cuentas de los responsables de los crímenes y la plena reparación para las víctimas. Debemos proteger a los niños ucranianos que deben volver a sus familias y a su patria sin más demoras. La liberación de los prisioneros de guerra, junto con el regreso de los niños ucranianos, son prioridades cruciales. Nosotros trabajamos con vosotros. Italia puede hacer todo lo que puede. Defendemos la soberanía de Ucrania y trabajamos por la paz. Trabajamos por un encuentro Ucrania y Rusia para concluir este encuentro con una paz durable. Gracias.
His Excellency Mr. Tajani for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
I'd like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Estonia, Finland, Italy, Luxembourg, Slovakia, Spain, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, in February, this Council marked 3 years since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war that has brought immense suffering and instability to the region and beyond. On that occasion, this Council and the General Assembly adopted resolutions calling for its swift end and for a lasting peace. Since then, we have seen intense diplomatic engagement, but we have also seen an intensification of the fighting across Ukraine and at times into the Russian Federation. Ukrainian civilians continue to endure relentless bombardment in their homes, schools, hospitals and shelters.